When it comes to British motorcycles, the name of Norton has always been synonymous with performance and style. Like so many British motorcycle manufacturers, the company's roots were firmly established in the bicycle industry and in the Midlands. James Lansdowne Norton of Birmingham began the Norton Manufacturing Company in 1898, making chains and other items for bicycles, the greatest transport innovation of the day. But the need for speed is evidently not a modern phenomenon, because in 1902, the first Norton motorbike was produced when an engine was added to a bicycle frame. It was a revolution indeed, and progress was unstoppable. The advent of motorsport was inspirational to Norton, and when one of his motorcycles, complete with a Peugeot engine, won the first ever TT race on the Isle of Man in 1907, the company expanded into the newly evolving transport marketplace. This is Harrods in London's fashionable Knightsbridge, and if you'd wanted to purchase a Norton motorcycle in 1909, you could have bought one from here. There was a choice of 8 models, but despite the popularity of the new motoring craze, Norton struggled as a business. The man responsible for giving his name to these motorcycles was a very good engineer, but not so skilled as an entrepreneur, and by 1913 the company faced bankruptcy. Fortunately, one of the main creditors stepped in to save the day and formed Norton Motors Limited, allowing manufacturing to continue. Between 1914 and 1918, Norton's factory was kept busy with contracts for World War I, supplying motorcycles for the Russian army, Great Britain's allies. The company needed to move to larger premises in the Aston area of Birmingham, and it was at this time that the now famous Norton logo started to appear. As peace followed the war that was supposed to end all wars, James Norton fulfilled his dream of creating an overhead valve machine. The Model 18 first appeared in 1922 and quickly became established as one of the fastest motorcycles around. These were the golden years of the British motorcycling industry, as racing, whether in the TT on the Isle of Man or the Brooklands Road Special, put every new design to the test. James Norton died in 1925 at the age of 56, but his legacy lived on when a new design with an overhead camshaft helped the company to dominate the racing circuits of Britain and Europe for the next 25 years. However, the war to end all wars proved to have offered false hope. World War II broke out in 1939, and during the 6 years of the conflict, more than 100,000 Nortons were manufactured for military use, as production of the rest of the range was suspended. In the post-war years, such classics as the Dominator and the Commando all added to Norton's credibility. But the 1953 takeover by Associated Motorcycles Limited set a downward trend from which the British motorcycle industry, and inevitably Norton, would never fully recover. But that's quite enough history to be going on with, so let's take a step back in time to Norton's heyday and enjoy a priceless selection of the very best of British bikes. The Norton 16H lineage can be traced back as far as 1911, with this quaint press release from the Gentleman's Journal of that very same year, extolling the virtues of the Norton Manufacturing Company's motorbike production. The most wonderful point about the Norton machine is its graceful and almost fragile appearance. It looks the beau ideal of elegance. In fact, it suggests effeminacy. You find yourself wondering where its marvellous strength and power comes from. It is so scientifically designed that the art of its construction conceals its Herculean capabilities. It must have taken years of study to perfect such a purveyor of power. It may be driven at a walking pace or at 50 miles per hour, or, if a greater speed is desired, a 12 horsepower engine will carry you along at 80 miles per hour with perfect comfort if your respiratory organs will stand it. The Norton 16H has been an Isle of Man TT racer, a family transport sidecar holder, and a wartime dispatch rider within its 33-year history. Like the other Norton motorcycles of its era, this machine was stamped with incredible longevity and a proud tradition. The Model 16, as it was originally called, was very similar in design and specifications to the very first Norton ever built, the Big Four, which was a particular favourite of James Lansdowne Norton, the founder of the company. The main difference between the two was the 16H used a smaller engine, but with the same 79mm x 100mm dimensions. The 490cc single-cylinder side-valve four-stroke engine managed a top speed of around 80 miles per hour with an external valve gear. The Big Four frame was also used on the 16H, but this had an extraordinarily high clearance from the ground. To distinguish between models, the 16H frame was redesigned to have a lower ground clearance, and this became known as the home model for travelling around England, and this is what the H in its name derived from. Because James Lansdowne Norton had travelled around South Africa on a Big Four and noted how the roads were different in the outer reaches of the British Empire, the high ground clearance frames came to be known as colonial models for riding abroad. World War I intervened in the production and development of the 16H model, and it wasn't until 1919 that a Norton 490cc engine acquired a chain drive with a 3-speed gearbox. A saddle tank eventually replaced the flat tank of the earlier 16H models in 1929, and the frame went through several carefully designed and up-to-date changes in order to make it more aerodynamic and aesthetically pleasing. During the 1930s, a few more changes took place. These included the change of the position of the exhaust pipe, which switched from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. This was quickly followed by a new 4-speed gearbox, which replaced the 3-speed one, and had been available on other Norton models for a few years previously. Because the 16H was a relatively cheap motorcycle to produce, without the quality, reliability, or assured road handling ability being diminished, it soon caught the eye of the British Army. As the approach of an impending Second World War dominated the whole of the United Kingdom, Norton's factory in Birmingham, deep in the heart of the Midlands, began producing a military version of the Model 16H for possible use in the war. Taking the engine from the 1937 version, with an open valve gear and a high ground clearance frame with crankcase shield, and stripping it down to the bare essentials in case of off-road action, this military version of the 16H was capable of taking all the abuse that a rider or a terrain could throw at it. The buffer stops on the forks and the lower overall gearing enabled the rider to travel across smooth or rough ground with equal power and balance. Up to 100,000 of these military 16H machines were delivered and used during the entirety of the Second World War, which started in 1939 and ended in 1945. The military 16H motorcycles were painted in accordance with which branch of the military they were issued to. The Army had olive green or khaki. The Royal Air Force had light blue paintwork, whereas the Navy had a deeper and darker blue. Some of the specially built and military tested 16H machines even stayed in Army service well into the 1950s. Such was their ease for mechanics to maintain and for soldiers to master. After the war had ended, the 16H motorbikes were finally updated with the legendary Norton Road Holder forks replacing the girder forks, a new alloy cylinder head added, a different valve gear that was now enclosed rather than exposed, and the usual nips and tucks of cosmetic surgery on the bodywork. The fuel tank increased in capacity too, from the standard 2.75 gallons to a much more user-friendly 3.5 gallons. By 1950, the gearbox was changed from the upright version to a new laid-down design. The Norton 16H finally ceased production alongside all the other side-valve engine motorcycles in 1954. It had played a big part in the Second World War, and for that alone, it'll always be guaranteed a place in history. The Model 18 has a long history in production with Norton, starting as it did in 1922 and not ceasing manufacture until an amazing 32 years later in 1954. The Model 18 was so called because it was, logically enough, the 18th model that the Norton Manufacturing Company had made since they started producing motorbikes in 1902. All of these earlier Norton motorcycles were side-valve, belt-driven machines and were built predominantly for racing. Eventually, Norton had to bow to the predominant post-World War I trend of motorbikes with an OHV engine. That's an engine configuration in which all the valves are located in the cylinder head and the camshaft is located in the cylinder block. The camshaft operates the valves via lifters and push rods. But it must be noted that James Lansdowne Norton, the company's founder and principal engineer, was talking about overhead valves with desmodromic operation as early as 1913, just before the onset of World War I. The desmodromic valve control in the engine was an important development in motorcycling history. The valves in this system are positively closed by a leverage operation rather than relying on the more conventional springs to close them. The valves in question are the ones that allow air into the cylinder, and the alternating ones that allow exhaust gases out. In general mechanical terms, desmodromic is used to refer to mechanisms that have different controls for their actuation in different directions. The word desmodromic is derived from two Greek words: desmo, meaning controlled, linked, and dromos, meaning course, track. For an easy example, certainly one that's easier to say, if you imagine a saw cutting a tree trunk, the pushing and pulling of the saw is a desmodromic action. Whereas something like opening a door is not, because the handle is only controlled in opening, while the closing is less controlled, as it relies on an automatic spring. So, with this desmodromic control in the Norton bikes, no return springs are used, and the engine relies on compression to seat the valves. This allowed for much higher revs per minute and horsepower, which immediately proved itself in racing, and racing was the thing that James Lansdowne Norton was most interested in. In 1922, the first OHV machine, the Model 18, was wheeled out of the factory after being overseen in production and design by James Norton himself. Sadly, he never lived to see the continued success of his motorbikes, as he died in 1925, just when the Norton OHV bikes were establishing themselves as a force to be reckoned with on the racetrack. He did, however, live long enough to see his Model 18 break 18 world records at the Brooklands testing site in 1923. Brooklands was a motor racing circuit built near Weybridge in Surrey, England in 1907. It was the first custom-built oval-shaped circuit in the world, and at the end of the First World War, the track became the venue for motorcar and motorbike manufacturers to test their new models. The Model 18 used the 70mm x 100mm bore and stroke, and had an engine capacity of 490cc, with a top speed of roughly 80 miles per hour. After it had been pre-tested at Brooklands Racing Circuit, it was immediately used in the famous TT race on the Isle of Man, which it won in 1924. The sporting prowess of the Model 18 was soon overshadowed with the introduction of the overhead camshaft engine, which forced the Model 18 to slide comfortably into its niche as a touring rather than a racing vehicle. Norton's advertising slogan hyped the bike's performance and reliability, which stemmed from their reputation from the racetrack, and this is how the Model 18 was marketed, as a thrilling racing bike. In truth, this machine was a simple, solid and very basic motorbike, with a high, spindly frame, girder forks and a robust nature that suited your average motorbike punter in the 1920s and 1930s, rather than a speed demon who yearned for the fast bends and tight corners of a racetrack. Because of its sure handling, easy road holding and decent but tiny brakes, the Model 18 was the ideal bike to fit a sidecar onto. This was helped in 1925 by the addition of a 4-speed gearbox, which had a crossover drive that allowed the rear chain to be on the right-hand side of the Model 18, allowing much easier maintenance accessibility for when a sidecar was bolted on. During the 1930s, the Model 18 also gained a saddle tank, a proper gear oil pump, and an inboard magneto, which was an ignition device that produced the alternating current for distribution to the spark plugs. Earlier versions had the magneto in front of the engine, which made it very vulnerable in wet weather and needed a splash guard fitted to keep the water out. In 1954, the Model 18, along with the side valve motorbikes with which it had shared many key parts, was put to rest and now belongs in the hands of the dedicated classic motorcycling enthusiast. The Norton Internationals were introduced in 1930 and comprised of two different designs, the Model 30 and the Model 40 machines. These famous single overhead camshaft racers, both the 350cc version and the 490cc version, were the catalyst for the most famous Norton racing bike of all time, the Norton Manx, in 1938. The International, at the time, was the premier racing motorcycle and was designed by Norton's chief development engineer and manager of their successful racing team, Joe Craig. He'd joined the Norton Manufacturing Company as a test and racing rider and, more importantly, an engineer in 1926, and held on to the development reins with a vice-like grip until 1955. When the Internationals hit the racing circuit, they notched up a host of wins around the globe, hence why the name International became so appropriate. The 490cc machine bulldozed its way through the opposition to take the senior TT crown, whilst the 350cc machine danced through the crowd of competitors to take the junior TT top spot. In 1932, the first Internationals went on sale to the public in both the larger and smaller versions, with little concessions for the home market. In effect, these quick-selling motorbikes were almost virtual replicas of the powerful TT racers, with road holder forks replacing the racing webs that were originally fitted. The wheels were easily detachable as a result of being designed and fitted to a racing motorcycle, and the large fuel tank had beautiful aerodynamic sporting lines. They also had hairpin valve springs which could be easily changed without the terrible inconvenience of removing the cylinder head. It was the classic engine, though, that really made these machines fly. The single-cylinder, four-stroke powerhouse had a very strong bottom end and massive flywheels, with the valve gear bolted to the top of the cylinder head. The camshaft, however, was housed in a completely separate casing, even though that too was bolted to the top of the head. All of this new design and layout resulted in a very tall engine that earned it the nickname the Tower of Power. This was mainly noticeable by the long and highly polished tube that housed the drive shaft and led to the overhead cam. An oil system with more twists and turns than a complicated rabbit warren of underground tunnels fed the lubricant via adjustable jets to the main parts of the engine. This all added up to something in the region of a 29 brake horsepower output and a top speed of close to 100 miles per hour. However, because of the emergence of the Norton Manx Grand Prix as the #1 racing bike, the International's engine received hardly any development beyond 1936, which, oddly, never affected its ability to sell in great quantities to the public. It had gained a new clutch in 1934 though, and a Norton gearbox replaced the Sturmey Archer one that had been used on the initial races. In 1936, the last change was made to the International engine before work stopped on updating it. An alloy cylinder barrel and head were fitted with a bronze combustion chamber and aluminium fins. The electrical system was also somewhat revised, with 14mm spark plugs now added. In 1937, Norton lost their most famous racing face. Jimmy Guthrie, the world-famous Norton racing rider from 1931 to 37, completed a junior and senior double on the Norton Internationals in the Isle of Man TT race. But after winning 6 times in his illustrious career with Norton, had to end his final TT race with retirement in 1937 when his engine failed. Later that year, he was tragically killed while trying to snatch victory from a supercharged BMW motorbike in the German Grand Prix. Many believe that this was one of the reasons that Norton lost faith in the Internationals, as they mourned his loss and instead concentrated on the Norton Manx motorbike. The biggest change to the Norton Internationals was made after the engine stopped being updated, and that was in the frame, when a rigid plunger rear-end suspension and girder forks were fitted in 1938. These were fitted a year after they'd been used with great success in the racing models. The difference between the Norton Internationals with racing fittings and a sleek look unmatched anywhere else at the time, and the other standard sports models that were on sale to the general public, was the price. The Norton Internationals became very expensive, although this didn't stop them from selling well, and they were always a desirable purchase for any true motorcycling enthusiast. It was the advent of the Second World War, with military orders coming in for the increased production of Norton's single-valve 16H models, which signalled the end of the line for the sportier Internationals. The Internationals took the checkered flag for the last time in 1939, and the first half of the story of the Norton International ended right there. Production began after the end of the Second World War, when the Norton International went back into production in 1947. But the book was closed for the very last time in 1953. The Norton International was truly a great racing bike, with a public version that thrilled and delighted by equal measure. The Norton 500T Competition is a beautiful machine, with a look that combines classic roadster with classic off-roadster. It is essentially a trials motorbike, meaning that it was developed specifically for off-road riding. During the pre-war era of Norton manufacturing, the so-called trials bikes had only been available via mail order. For instance, the Colonial was one such bike, which had been developed by James Lansdowne Norton, the revered founder of the company, in the 1920s, after taking a riding holiday in South Africa. And it wasn't until the relatively late date of 1948 that such a machine was built and sold in the normal Norton range of motorcycles. This was the Norton 500T Competition. In the post-World War II years, motorcycle trials became a very popular pastime. An entire generation of young men returned to civilian life after the constant adrenaline rush of war, and although they were undoubtedly glad to have survived, there was most definitely a void to be filled. Motorcycles offered great excitement, whether just for transportation, road racing, or on the trial circuits, and machines like this one were very highly prized indeed. The Norton 500T started out with the diamond frame from the Norton 16H, with the same road holder forks at the front. However, the wheelbase was reduced considerably by sharply raking these road holder forks to bring them in line with the steering column. The 490cc engine of the Norton Model 18 and subsequently the Norton ES2 was then fitted into this frame, with a crankcase shield bolted underneath it. The only difference here was that this refitted engine had a bi-metal alloy head and barrel to try and keep the weight of the bike down to a minimal 300 pounds. This was eventually achieved by making other parts of the motorcycle lighter in the initial construction, like the silencer, rear engine plates, mudguards, number plates, and a 7-inch front brake. This front brake was also fitted with a water-excluding ring in a scalloped hub, and the cast iron brake drum was drilled with large holes to help with the lightness issue. The work to make this 24 brake horsepower motorcycle a less heavy machine than the previous Nortons was also continued through to other aspects of the bike. Wheel rims were created from high tensile steel. A rubber saddle was used with alternative mountings to adjust the seat height, along with fully adjustable handlebars. The lighting was optional, with a detachable headlamp with plug and socket wiring, and the lighter than usual oil tank had a filler cap set in the top to keep it out of the rider's way. The light steel, welded 2.5 gallon holding petrol tank was mounted on horizontal rubber insulated springs for the front of the bike, whilst the rear had a single fixing of rubber, making it all very fast and friendly for mechanical removal. The earliest examples at the Norton 500T had a high-level exhaust system, but just a year after it was introduced, it had been swept down to be clipped to the front engine cradle, over the right footrest, and lowered further with an upswept silencer. This was a quick and easy bike that managed an excellent 24 brake horsepower at 5,300 revs per minute and was extremely popular with private owners. It also performed well as a trials machine, continuing the grand Norton tradition of reliability and success, with nothing much added to each subsequent model as each year went by. The odd part was replaced here and there with a lighter alloy version in order to make the 500T equivalent to someone on a continuous Weight Watchers diet, but it never became anorexic, lost its appetite, or ran out of energy. The pre-war style gearbox was never updated and remained firmly tucked in between the back of the crankcase and the rear wheel, fitted as it was with wide ratios and a folding kickstart lever. The only main feature added was the inclusion of the clutch from the perennially popular Norton Manx motorbike, which had performed so well on the racing circuit. It was still selling well and looking good when it disappeared, seemingly without reason, from the Norton catalogue in the September of 1953. The Norton 500T competition truly is a beautifully shaped motorbike, even by 21st century standards, with a ride that matched its aesthetic qualities. Packed all the punch of a heavyweight with the weigh-in of a featherweight. Norton never produced another trials bike after discontinuing this model, and the 500T competition was the last shining example of its kind. The Norton Dominator was built specifically to counteract the success of the Triumph's pre-World War II twin-cylinder engine. Having been aware that other factories were working on the same design, Norton feared getting left behind in the competitive marketplace and subsequently set to work on creating their own twin-cylinder motorbike. However, Norton wanted to go one better and beat Triumph at its own game. So, with this in mind, an engineer called Bert Hopwood produced some top-secret plans in 1947 to allow Norton a head start in the post-war race for the motorcycle-buying individuals' hard-earned money. Bert Hopwood had noted the design faults of the Triumph's twin-cylinder engine, along with other factories' designs too, and aimed to improve on such things as the poor cooling and double camshaft for inlet and outlet exhaust valves. The first Dominator, the Model 7, was driven out of Norton's factory in 1949 with a single carburettor, splayed exhausts and a special tank and mudguards. It displayed Norton's usual flair for faultless handling and reliability, but the Dominator was around £20 more expensive than similar range models, and consequently it didn't really take off until the revamped model became available. This was the featherbed-framed Dominator 88, which was a good £40 lighter than the Model 7, and it became available to the public in 1953. The featherbed was a revolutionary frame that had been used with tremendous success on the single-cylinder Norton Manx racing bikes. It was built to house various types of Norton engines with a distinctive twin-loop design, and this proved perfectly suited to the twin-cylinder engine of the Dominator. In 1956, the granddaddy of all Dominators arrived on the scene, ready to outpower and outmaneuver all that came before it. This version of the Norton Classic was called the Dominator 99, which had some serious engine and performance development implemented before it went on sale. This new 596cc parallel twin 4-stroke engine had a new alloy cylinder head, higher compression and an AML monoblock carburettor. The rear of the slimline frame dispensed with the bolts and became snugly welded to the dual seat. Enlarging both bore and stroke to 68 by 82mm gave the engine this new capacity for speed. The Daytona camshaft, developed for the racing Manx motorbike, was also fitted on the Dominator 99, and this helped it to a top speed of a teeth-chattering 100 miles per hour. The power output jumped from 29 to 31 horsepower at 6,500 revs per minute. Slight adjustments to the frame improved aerodynamics to match the high performance of the engine. The Norton Dominator 99 stood at £395 when dry. This was less than its predecessor, even though it had an increased top speed and overall power. It was also fitted with the famous road holder telescopic forks at the front of the bike and twin shocks to the rear for improved suspension when riding. The front and back brakes were just a simple drum at both ends, but they did what they were supposed to do, so this was never a problem. But it's the look of the Norton Dominator that draws your eye past the statistics and onto the bike itself. The beautiful, slim curves and economic engineering give it the defined shape of a racing greyhound. There's nothing dumpy or stocky about this motorcycle, and it takes off like a startled rabbit after the coil transmission is kicked into life. The bulbous and large single headlight glares out from the front of the bike, nestled happily between the flat Norton handlebars that give the rider a smooth and comfortable experience. A new rear subframe, a swing arm suspension, and much more narrow fuel tank became a staple for the Dominator 99 in a slight revamp in 1960, giving an even more manageable feel to the machine with these reduced dimensions. Norton's tagline in advertising was "the world's best road holder," and this was not a statement they made lightly. The Norton Dominator hugged the tarmac like a long-lost friend and ate up the road with a huge appetite for such a thin bike. In 1962, the 600cc engine was given added poke with a long-stroke 646cc motor that increased the Dominator's output to 49 bhp at 6,800 revs per minute. This was the Dominator's last hurrah, even though it gained a rare foothold in the increasingly lucrative American export market, and when the engine was bored out again to increase it to 745cc, the high vibration that came along with it proved too uncomfortable for the added price tag. But the Dominator 99, the middle model of this Norton machine, proved to be the most stylish and the most sought after of the Dominator range. It was slim, it was fast, and it was a true thoroughbred. The Norton Commando was probably the best loved machine to come out of the last years of the British motorcycle industry. Hailed as the best and most famous parallel twin-engine bike of them all, it even won the Motorcycle News Machine of the Year competition 5 times in a row. It's easy to see why. The very first Commando was unveiled at the Earl's Court Show London in 1967 to a great reception. The sleek and strikingly original styling earned this Norton the name Fastback. The praise went to 2 development engineers, Bernard Hooper and Bob Trigg, helped by engineering director Dr. Stephen Bauer. They suggested that a conventional frame design was not aerodynamic enough and lacked good engineering principles. They also knew that the engine vibrations that had plagued earlier Norton twin-engine bikes would not be tolerated by a new generation of riders. Taking an existing 745cc engine from the Norton Atlas, they modified it to fit a radical new chassis by isolating the angled forward engine from the rider, as well as the transmission train and rear wheel. The engine was assembled together with the gearbox and swing arm as one unit. The twin cradle frame consisted of a large main spine plus twin down tubes, to which the engine became attached by means of adjustable rubber mounts at 3 calculated points. This was known as the isolastic system, and it allowed the motor to shake, rattle and roll with its 1950s origins, whilst keeping the late 1960s rider as peaceful and as laid back as the hippie doctrine of the time. 6 years after the initial success of the Commando 750 in 1973, the 745cc engine was bored out to produce a larger 850 Commando with a 4-stroke twin engine of 828 cc's. This powerful bike looked just as good as it sounded, with a distinctive seat unit made of fiberglass. The sporty hump that dominated the rear, which earned it the nickname Fastback, gave the bike a racing line that echoed the success the previous model had achieved at the 1973 Formula 750 TT, with Peter Williams riding it. The Norton 850 Commando was available in a standard roadster edition and also a large tanked interstate version. This was so it could appeal to the speedy individual who wanted to tear around the countryside as if he were Peter Williams, and the more sedate rider who enjoyed the long-distance touring of the same countryside with an eye on an enjoyable ride rather than a full-out race. The Commando 850 is one of the few British twin-engine machines that could accelerate from 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds, which was revolutionary in its day, and the top speed was a blistering 120 miles per hour when you moved quickly through the 4-speed gearbox. Masses of torque could thrust the light and narrow chassis forwards in an exhilarating and breathtaking manner. The fuel capacity of the Commando 850 was approximately a respectable 3 gallons, which gave the engine a top horsepower of 51 when ridden at 6,250 revs per minute. This was slightly down on the 750 version because of the increased weight of the 850's engine, which, although sitting at 221 kilograms when dry, still provided a light and assured feel to the bike that was unrivaled at the time of production. The air-cooled engine overheated at continued top speed, but this was only ever a problem if you were breaking the speed limit. Of course, before the engine had time to overheat at that continued pace, the police would have pulled you over and handed you a speeding ticket. The Commando cemented Norton's reputation for reliable and trustworthy handling at high speed, with the efficient telescopic road holder front forks, the twin shock rears, and the single disc front and expanding rear brakes. The electronic ignition starter was introduced to the 850 Commando 2 years later, but by that time, the British twin-engine machine was already showing its age, especially in comparison to the newer designs flooding the home market from the Japanese sector. The Commando 850 was the last public motorcycle made by Norton before the company went into enforced liquidation, churning out the last few of these mean machines in 1978. Many people have wondered how this could have happened when the Commando was top of its field and such a successful bike, but the climate was changing. Norton continued low-key development of a motorbike designed and built specifically for several British police forces with a rotary engine over the next 10 years, but nothing matched the speed, grace and power of the Norton Commando. Since its untimely demise, interest has risen again in this classic bike, and enthusiasts will pick up a Commando 850 nowadays, as opposed to a similar Japanese bike, and spend every available weekend rebuilding their Commandos to match specific production design. The practicality and definite character of these classic British bikes make them, even now, a cut above the competition. As surprising in attack and using as much stealth in its quiet nature, the Commando deserves to be named after the soldier of the same name. It's well trained, dangerous to provoke, and fights to the end with every last drop of energy and strength. Commando by name, Commando by nature. As this great celebration of Norton Motorcycles draws to a close, the latter years of the company's history, like the British motorcycle industry in general, failed to produce a happy ending. In the post-World War II years, there were some excellent new models to come out of Norton. Initially, the H16 and similar pre-war machines were the order of the day. But with Bert Hopwood and Joe Craig on board from 1946 onwards, the OHV Vertical Twins, OHC Development and Manx racing bikes proved very successful. Another huge advance was made in the 1950s, when brothers Rex and Cromie McCandless designed Norton's classic featherbed frame. From 1953, the addition of swinging fork rear suspension improved matters even further, as Norton enjoyed an enviable reputation for producing top-notch motorcycles that were both fast on the racetrack and ideal for everyday motoring. Nevertheless, despite design innovation, by the 1950s Norton had run into financial difficulties and in 1953 was bought by Associated Motorcycles, manufacturers of AJS and Matchless. This amalgamation of British motorcycle companies did to a point make financial sense. However, when such great marques were all grouped together where one struggled, they all faced disaster. Also, AMC failed to capitalise on the assets that they had, and this was the beginning of the end for Norton. During the 1960s, Norton left their Birmingham roots behind, with production transferred to AMC's London factory. When AMC collapsed in 1966, it was taken over by Manganese Bronze Holdings, when the Norton name was promoted as Norton Villiers, and then finally Norton Villiers Triumph. Sadly, this was all to no avail, as the group went bankrupt in 1977. Thankfully, quality will always win the day, and due to the hard work and commitment of classic motorcycle enthusiasts, the Norton heritage lives on. The wonderfully evocative names of the Dominator, Commando, and the International have been kept alive by collectors all over the world for future generations of Norton riders, and, as you've seen demonstrated throughout this programme, not under glass cases in museums. These motorcycles are ridden on a daily basis, used for the purpose for which they were designed all those years ago. It's also interesting to note that the Nortons tend to be very popular with the ladies who ride classic motorcycles, of whom there are a pleasingly high number. The golden age of the British motorcycle might be long gone, but one thing's absolutely for certain: the classic Norton motorcycles will never be forgotten.